Hey everyone, I'm Kaitlyn Barnard.
And I'm Victor Gamov.
In this series, we chat with software developers and technology leaders to tackle your biggest API connectivity challenges.
Stay tuned to this episode for tools, tactics, strategies that will help you to take your distributed architectures to the next level. Let's begin. And I'm extremely excited, super excited for this show. I don't even remember when the last time I was super excited for that guest, because today I have a Jessica Deen, Principal Cloud Advocate at Microsoft. And my friend, Jessica, welcome to Kongcast.
Thank you so much for having me, Victor.
How you been? What's new and exciting in your life? Last time I saw you, you didn't do principal job, but you always delivered super awesome demos that were on the level of principal or even staff developer advocate.
Thank you. So that's probably the newest thing is I am officially a principal cloud advocate at Microsoft as of last September. And then other than that, I'm just living the pandemic quarantine life, adjusting to this new world. I think, gosh, it's been, 2 or 3 years. I think the last time we hung out was at KubeCon. We went and did CrossFit, and then they turned us into a graphic, and that was fun. Always a great time hanging out. But still living the Kubernetes life and whatnot. Just
lots of home improvements. I see you doing a lot of house. Lots of home automation. Awesome projects around how to automate some of the life.
Yeah, I love taking things that should be simple, like turning a light switch on, and complicating it to simplify it. So now I can visualize it on a dashboard. I love just having fun, right? Tinkering, hacking, geeking out. It's always a good time.
So I have a question to you.
Okay.
I interviewed a bunch of different folks, and we talk about more like a day two type of stuff. Like when we already wrote our application, we develop our application, everything is on Kubernetes these days. Like we talk about observability, but I didn't talk much in the show about, the developers, how they would develop, how they would transition their workflow. And one of the questions that I recently had having a conversation with customer when they said, well, we right now know how to run everything in one monolithic application. We have a Java EE container. We have every developer has its own the version of the software on their computer. They package this in WAR or ER or all this kind of stuff and deploy this in this huge JBoss container. Like you telling us how to do this microservices stuff, but we don't know how to develop this. And that's why I think that would be good opportunity for us to chat about this and answer this question. How you can go from the one place, that where have everything in one place and you can debug this and put different breakpoints and different the codes because it's one process.
Yep.
And we can talk about some tools that you working or your team is working on as well, specifically to Kubernetes as well.
Yeah, the goal is to simplify that day two experience, right? A lot of the things, everyone wants Kubernetes, everyone wants abstraction. It's been around now for 6 years, and even at conferences, the CEO and CTO is like, okay, go sit in on every Kubernetes session and every abstraction session and every distributed systems. Insert buzzword here, go learn about that technology. And once you've learned about it, once you've implemented it, once you've done that abstraction, from a developer perspective, how do you keep the same inner loop that you're used to? How do you still, as you said, hit breakpoints and debug effectively when now you have different services? You have a multi-container scenario, or you have several different APIs, and let's say that you're troubleshooting one of them, but you still need to connect to the other ones. How do you set that up in a local dev environment? And that's been one of the challenges that I think anyone faces when they're on that day two scenario of, okay, we're now doing distributed systems. We've abstracted everything, but how do I still develop and debug effectively and quickly, right? The goal is still to be agile and iterate. And what's the best way to do that? There's actually open source tools and products that you can use that I personally am super passionate about, mainly because it makes it not only easy, but it makes it fun again. It's great.
So some of the time ago, back in the day, the Kelsey Hightower called kube control or kubectl or kubectl. By the way, how you pronounce it? What's your favorite way to pronounce it?
I pronounce it with the letter K. That's my terminal. That simplifies it. I want to type as little as possible. I don't have a preference. I know some people are like, I don't cuddle with my Kubernetes. Sometimes you do. I mean, sometimes you're all over your cluster trying to figure out what's going on. But kubectl, 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 as long as we all know what we're talking about, we can communicate effectively.
Yeah, so he essentially called kube control command as like a modern day SSH. So if you wanted to do something, you SSH to the server, and now you have a kube control, you SSH to your Kubernetes cluster. And to bring this parallel, in my times when I was working in consultancy in the Java E world, so we had this kind of like SSH tunnel to remote machine where we can have a install kind of a remote debugging session with my JVM and do similar things. Can we do something like this in the Kubernetes world these days, since we start with kind of moving our mindset from this monolithical Java E application? Can we do the same in the Kubernetes world?
Yeah, you absolutely can. And you can do it also, in my opinion, a lot easier. So, I mean, the type of scenario you're talking about, I mean, whether you're SSHing or you're RDPing or you're connecting somehow over to a server and then you're setting up your remote tools so that your system can still connect. And that's still a lot of manual steps. I mean, that was the old school way, but that's still a lot of things that you're having to set up and configure. With Kubernetes, you can actually use something called Bridge to Kubernetes. That's an extension from Visual Studio Code. Now, that's one part of it. But when I set up the extension, I literally run through a few commands where I make sure that my computer has access to my cluster. So there are a few presumptions. One, you're already going to have a Kubernetes cluster. Two, you're already going to have access to that Kubernetes context and config, and you have some sort of control for that cluster. Once you do, that particular extension, Bridge to Kubernetes, is going to utilize that local context information and create a connection. The extension itself will actually set up your task.json and Visual Studio Code launch.json, and it'll actually configure a debugger that uses your same, like let's say that you're writing in, I don't know, Node, and you already have a Node npm debug configuration. It'll use that and then attach a Kubernetes task to it. So the extension is doing all of that configuration that you and I used to have to do manually back in the day. The extension's doing it for you. Now, once you run it, that extension also on the back end behind the scenes is deploying a pod for you to your cluster called Routing Manager. That Routing Manager uses Envoy. All of this happens behind the scenes, but it uses Envoy to help route traffic for you to use as you're doing your local development. You can do it either in an isolated fashion, or you could completely hijack traffic for one particular service, depending on what type of cluster you're working in. Obviously, in production, you would never want to give access to that. But the cool thing is again, that extension is doing all of that configuration for you. And once that routing manager lives in your cluster, it lives there permanently, and you can actually end up communicating with that through the Kubernetes binary, kube control, kubectl, or K, as I like to call it. And then you can tap into that even from things like GitHub Actions or whatever your preferred CI/CD system is. It's really powerful.
Yeah, that's pretty cool. Okay, so let's talk about the workflow. So I'm developing this like the microservice application. So I have two services. One service written in Go, one service written in Node, and now I need to understand for example, Node service, that's going to be my service that will be providing some exchange rates, and our Go service will be calling this exchange rate in order to display our prices of our stuff on the website. So how we will be able to see when our applications are breaking, for example, we were getting this like a 502, or when we're trying to call one of the service, can we debug this with Bridge to Kubernetes?
Yes, you absolutely can. So, I mean, first off, to answer your question, like, how can you see that? I would hope a lot of times when people talk about DevOps, the emphasis tends to always be on CI/CD, but DevOps itself is so much more, right? I mean, just to go by the quote that Microsoft stands behind, DevOps is the union of people, process, and products to enable continuous delivery of value to our end users. If we break that down, value is the most important word in that definition. How are you delivering value if your end users are receiving those 502 errors, right? Or 400 errors or 301 errors or whatever kind of errors? I would hope that there's also some observability and monitoring in place as part of your workflow and your setup, right? That's more of a design implementation and like mindset shift. Once you know that, okay, we're getting those errors, we have that, we've seen that on a dashboard or a Jira ticket's been open or whatever your workflow is. From a developer's perspective, okay, I want to go in and troubleshoot that. Now, the first thing I would do is I'm going to have the code somewhere on my system, my Git repo, and depending on how your structure is, whether you have a mono repo or individual project folders, whatever that is, you go into the service. So if I'm working, like, let's say I wanted to debug the Go microservice, I would make sure that I'm opening Visual Studio Code within that one folder. I don't actually need, when I'm using Bridge to Kubernetes, I don't need the npm folder. Right now, I want to take a look at the Go folder. So I would have a launch.json and task.json, which is the VS Code configuration files. I would have that in the Go application, and I run my Go debugger. And that, depending on how I've configured it, would deploy out a isolated instance of the Go service. And because that routing manager and Envoy is living in the cluster, that's going to route traffic for me to use the Go service with the existing services in the cluster. I'm literally routing traffic just to my computer from a local development, so I can still attach to the NPM. Now I can do the same thing on the flip side. I can go into the NPM folder. I have my own launch.json and task.json Visual Studio Code files for the Node app, and then I can go and connect to the Go service that's living in the cluster. But both experiences from a developer perspective, all I'm working with is the code for that one service on my system. So it keeps it very traditional from a developer workflow experience, as I don't have to now go set up a Kubernetes cluster on my system, deploy out all the different Helm charts, deal with Docker files. Like, I'm literally just working with the code. In fact, with Bridge to Kubernetes, I don't touch a Helm chart or a Docker file. I'm touching just the code.
Yeah. And the rest of the stuff would be handled by, underlying tooling too.
The underlying tooling
package.
and all of that's happening in the back end. I'm giving details just so that people who are going to ask, like, well, how does it do that?
Yeah.
The extension's taking care of it, and you have the routing manager and all those services running in the background. But from a developer perspective, I'm just working on the Go code, or I'm just working on the Node code, or whatever language or framework you're working in.
Right. So, and in this case, it doesn't require you to have any special type of installation of Kubernetes. It can be like
you can use any Kubernetes cluster. You can even, if you wanted to, you could use Bridge to Kubernetes with like Kubernetes and Docker for Desktop or Minikube, or any Kubernetes cluster you want, you can connect Bridge to Kubernetes to.
Nice. So in this case, with the, I cannot stress enough and support the things that you just mentioned in terms of, like, if you have all sorts of tools that allow you to debug, you still need to have tools around observability and the things that you can explore. And because we're running distributed systems right now, we need to understand what is going on.
Yeah, and you don't know, like, how can you know if there's a problem if you can't see the problem? And again, if the goal is to continuously deliver value and be able to be agile and iterate quickly, how are you going to do that if your users are having a poor end user experience?
Right, makes sense. So that's super cool. Let me ask you another question that's also related to some of the developer productivity tools. What's your take on service mesh? Do you have any opinion about this? Like, is this something that developers should try to use it in 2022, or is something that maybe it's not ready for developers? It's only operations people who care about security. Just want to get your opinion about this.
So my opinion is going to be a little ambiguous, I guess. My opinion is it depends. It kind of depends what your goals are, what you're developing, what your application setup is. There's a lot of things that can vary. And if it works for you, and again, I always go back to the definition of the goal is to continuously deliver value. And if it is going to enable you to increase your ability of delivering value, to iterate faster, to be more valuable, then great, go ahead and implement it. But one thing that you said that I do want to touch on is developers do have a very biased mindset where they believe that security is the operator's responsibility. And my background was I came from an operations perspective, IT pro. I bridge the gap now with kind of developer, toe the line. I've worked on DevOps teams now and DevOps focus advocacy for, 5-6 years now at this point. And for that entire time, I am a very big proponent that security is everyone's responsibility. If you are touching code, if you are writing code, if you are supporting the infrastructure that code runs on, security is a responsibility. How you address that security may differ from like a service mesh or networking, or like from an infrastructure perspective, that might fall more into an operator's role. However, the developer can't just rely on operators or the security team or whomever to tell them that there's a flaw also in their code. And that's also where something like Bridge to Kubernetes comes in. Take the most recent Log4 exploit that we just dealt with, right? Developers were working overtime over the weekend, And being able to iterate quickly and troubleshoot that is really, really important, especially when you're working on these large enterprise teams. So going back to service mesh, again, it depends, but I don't agree with the mindset that, okay, well, if it's going to increase security, if it's going to increase networking, if it's going to increase my ability to be agile, that's the operator's job. As developers, we do still need to care. So if that is something that your team is looking at, it's in our best interest to always test things out and see, again, is it going to help us continuously deliver that value?
So if we're talking, if we stay on this like a tooling and the security side of things, so are there any other? I know, like in the recent years, Microsoft is just like on the crazy streak on delivering some cool tools for developers. Like I personally use Scaffold. I think Scaffold also was kind of like a Microsoft contributed a lot.
Yeah, we had Draft, which we built on top of Scaffold. Draft did get archived, which made me very sad. So if you're also sad, we can cry together. But I can say that I know that Microsoft is always looking for ways to kind of simplify things and build on top of that Scaffold experience, because that was great. But yeah, we're pretty big on developing tools that are always trying to simplify things.
What's new and exciting in like a security department then? So since we talk about this security stuff, maybe there's something that we need to look up in this space.
Yep.
For like maybe it's something in Azure that is available there that people can use.
There are a few things in Azure. One thing, so I love talking also about open source and then leading back to different ways that you can use it. It's part of the Azure GitHub repo. So github.com/Azure/container scan. And that particular container scan is a GitHub action that you can add to any GitHub Actions workflow, whether or not you're using Azure. That container scan tool has two open source additional tools included within it. Trivy, which is by Aqua, that's open sourced, and then I just had it in my head, Dockle. Trivy and Dockle, which will actually scan your container image to make sure that you are following CIS, Center for Internet Security best practices, as well as making sure that your container image itself doesn't have any vulnerabilities. And if it does, you can have it flag it and fail the build. You can scan that. The best practice would be to build your container image, scan the image before you push a compromised image into your repository. And assuming you're going through that workflow, if you are using Azure, the one thing that would then be specific to Azure is you can also tie in an additional action to publish those results, and you publish them into Azure Security Center. So previously, we talked so much about DevOps, and in my head, security is a part of that, because as I said, security is everyone's responsibility, and I wholeheartedly believe that. But now we're seeing terms of DevSecOps. And in a lot of companies, we still have security teams being separate from what developers and operations are doing. So traditionally, security teams would look at Azure Security Center or container registries and say, okay, well, we have to go back to the developers because this container image is compromised. It doesn't follow our policies, or what build did it trigger from? What run pushed it? There isn't any insight. And so now being able to publish the results from that container scan into that insight, it's keeping both the DevOps teams and security teams now, it's starting to bring them closer to the middle. It's not the perfect end goal, but it's starting to make sure that everyone's on the same page, which I think is really cool. And that's a relatively new feature. We demoed that at Build and Ignite last year. And again, if you just wanted to use the container scan tool, which uses Trivy and Dockle, that's completely, you can use that with any cloud. If you wanted to publish the results, that goes over into Azure.
So since we are on a developer tooling podcast, I cannot not ask the question about the naming. So we talk about these Dockle, Trivy things. Why Bridge to Kubernetes doesn't have some cute name? It's called Bridge to Kubernetes, and it's like we were thinking about how we're going to call this podcast. We're going to Bridge to Kubernetes, and in this case, it would be not super searchable, right? Because it's kind of very marketing type of term. It's not like something that developers, it's kind of like a synergy in Kubernetes. You can call it synergy in Kubernetes. It would be the same thing. Why there's no, and I know that Microsoft has a history of great code names in the past.
That's above my pay grade because I am not on that particular team. Ever since I saw it, it's been one of the tools in my particular workbench. However, I can tell you the name has gone through iterations. When we first announced it or announced something similar, it was Dev Spaces. But then that wasn't exactly accurate because at the time,
Spaces. There's plenty of.
Yeah, but then Apple has Spaces, but that's different because then even they've kind of changed it. But going back to the messaging, like dev spaces didn't feel really accurate because the way that was at the time is that was their play on like namespaces, and you'd have to set up your deployment in a separate namespace, which then creates issues when you're dealing with RBAC. So we kind of moved past that. It then became local process for Kubernetes, which was, in my opinion, a step down, obviously, from where we're currently at with bridge to Kubernetes. I like to shorten it to bridge to K8s, but obviously it's still not ideal. However, it is an open source tool. And so if you go and look it up on GitHub, the code name for that is Mindaro, Mindaro. I haven't had to spell that out loud before. So there is a back end code name that's public. I mean, that's the GitHub repo, but it's not what it's called, I guess, in Visual Studio. if you for the naming change, tag the team or tag me, and I'll tag the team and see if somebody has a suggestion. But naming is well above my pay grade. I just know that there's definitely been a history of changes.
Exactly. But like people like the naming also leads to some cute images that we can use for stickers.
Yeah.
The same thing.
And everyone loves stickers. I mean, I have my water bottle here, and I just
my favorite stickers is it's a beat, which is it's a mascot for some of the like Azure work that you guys doing.
Yeah.
And the beat, it's there's a developer advocate raccoon. So beat is a raccoon.
Yeah.
And I don't remember who told me that, but essentially the metaphor behind the beat, it's kind of a developer advocate is like a raccoon. It can be cute,
and it can be persistent in trying to figure out what's going on. And
and like in another life, we were spending a lot of time in conferences, and a lot of time we spent in airports and eating not super healthy, eating like junk food. Same thing as raccoons eating from not super healthy.
I didn't remember like how the bit had kind of came to be, but there are definitely parallels between it. I can tell you that the graphic work for all of that is done by Ashley McNamara on our team.
She's amazing. Yeah. Like the work around the golfer.
Yep.
You probably know. Like you can find some of the links in the description below. And this is a good time to remind that the Kongcast is a show where we release this in two formats. One, it's on YouTube, and we always kind of like a premiere to this. And right now we're recording this, but when we will publish it, you will be able to chat with our audience live. And when you watch this in YouTube, you will be able to get the awesome part of the show where Jessica will show all this the cool things that we just discussed about the bridge in Kubernetes. And for this, we're going into live demo.
All right, so we're currently looking at a bike sharing application called AdventureWorks Cycles. We are in a pandemic and COVID era, so I thought a bike sharing application was kind of perfect because when we want to go out and do things outside safely, we can go ride bicycles, right? And this particular application is already deployed in Kubernetes. There's several different services that make it up. There's a bikes application, there's a database. In fact, we can actually see all the different services here. We have billing, we have databases, we have gateway, reservation system, right? This is a genuine microservice architecture with several different services running, again, over in Kubernetes. Now, I can sign into the application here, and you're going to see, okay, I can choose a bike that I want to rent. I can go take a look. I like the one with orange tires. Only when I drill down into the particular bike selection, I'm not getting an image of the bike. Now, to make sure this isn't specific to one bike in particular, I'll go click on a different bike here, and I can see that this error or this issue is persistent across the board, right? Now, how would I troubleshoot this? In a traditional sense, it would be maybe a little challenging, or traditionally, I guess if I were using a monolithic application, I would just load the entire code base. But obviously, as you can see, we have quite a few services here. Now, for the sake of the demo, I happen to know that the issue and where I'm pulling that particular image request comes from the particular bikes pod right here. So I'm going to open the code in Visual Studio Code for just this one service. I'm going to forget about any of the other services here, and I'm only going to start taking a look at the code that handles the bikes particular API. And I already have that loaded in Visual Studio Code. It's written in Node. You can see all of that. I have even database connection string information. All of that goes through environment variables. But if I scroll down here, there's going to be a section for getting the bike. I can see that it's calling the API to get available bikes. Scrolling a little further down, I can see, okay, here's the API for all bikes and new bike. And somewhere down here is going to be one for an image. Let's go ahead and find that. And here it is right here under get bike, where I'm calling, okay, API bikes, look for the bike ID, get all this information. And again, this is a demo, but for the sake of the demo, I can see the problem happens to be probably line 235 because we have a logo hard-coded into the result. Now, to make sure that this is the actual code block that I want to troubleshoot, I'm going to set a breakpoint here right on line 239. And earlier when Vic and I were talking, I kept mentioning how when you drill down into your Git project repo, you're going to have a launch.json and task.json file for Visual Studio Code to connect to your debugger. You can see those files here. And I have one particular configuration that's going to launch my NPM, that's an existing debugger I have, only it's going to launch it with Kubernetes. The task.json is a task that it's going to start, which is going to use this bridge to Kubernetes extension I've installed. I've already pre-configured it with the port that I need for the application. The bike service is listening on port 3000. And I've also told it that I want to isolate this particular service. So it's going to allow me to debug this in an isolated fashion. Now, if you're new to Bridge to Kubernetes, you can go to the extension marketplace, search for Bridge to Kubernetes, and you simply click install. To get that configuration, those launch.json and task.json files, you would open your command palette, which would be Command-Shift-P on a Mac or Control-Shift-P on Windows, and you would simply run the Bridge to Kubernetes configure task, and you answer 4 questions. It's very simple. Everything else will then be done for you. So now that I have that debugger configured, and it's actually selected as my default debugger, I'm going to go ahead and hit F5. From there, Bridge to Kubernetes extension running within Visual Studio Code is going to start redirecting the service. I'm already connected to my Kubernetes cluster, as you saw a list of the pods, and I'm already in the namespace I want to work in. Now I'm going to go ahead and allow Bridge to Kubernetes to have administrator permissions. This is going to take control of my system from a networking perspective, so it can handle some of the back-end routing. But this is one of the things, again, I mentioned to Vic, that previously we would have to do this manually. But now the extension is actually handling all of this configuration for me. It's setting up the Kubernetes service environment. It's connecting everything. You can see I'm even getting notifications that it's waiting for the endpoint manager to come up. That's that routing manager I mentioned that was going to get deployed to the cluster. Aside from me having to install the extension and run through a few quick questions, I haven't had to do anything for this debugger to connect. So now I can see that I'm currently in the debug console. It's connected successfully. I do have my breakpoint. I'm going to go back over, actually, before I do that, I'm going to go back over to my terminal here, and we'll open a new window. And right from within Visual Studio Code, I'm going to do kgit ingress. And you'll see I now have a secondary ingress right down here that has my prefix. So I'm going to be working with this particular isolated URL. This one is still going to be broken with bikeapp.bikesharing. But if I open a new window and paste in my isolated instance, now I'm going to be able to troubleshoot that one service, that one bike service in the context of the larger application. And I'll be able to hit my breakpoint when I open a bike. Just like that, I can hit the breakpoint. I can now hover over this and see any kind of information. I could step through, I could step into, I could start debugging exactly as I normally would. I'm going to go ahead and comment this particular hard-coded image out. I'm going to save. We'll go ahead and restart the debugger here real quick just to make sure everything's completely fresh. I still have that breakpoint set. We're going to go ahead and restart this. I'll hit the breakpoint again, okay? And if I step through this time and go back over, now I can see that I'm starting to get that image, right? So now we've identified the problem. We have fixed the problem. I'm going to remove the breakpoint temporarily, and we'll just go back over to AdventureWorks, and we'll select another bike. Make sure that the image is showing up on any bike, which I can see it is there. And we'll do the one with orange tires that I liked as well. Great. So Bridge to Kubernetes was able to help me debug that one service while still accessing all the backend services. And it did that from my perspective as a developer, completely, like, it was behind the scenes, right? I didn't have to touch a Docker file. I didn't have to touch a Helm chart. I didn't even have to touch Kubernetes. I was able to debug exactly as I normally would. And I am now confident in this fix. but how do I ensure other members of my team are also confident in this fix? And more importantly, we want this fix to get out into production as soon as possible. So I'm going to stop my debugger. I'm going to go ahead and create a new branch here. We're going to call it bike image fix. Okay. Now I'm going to go ahead and check in this change. We can see the change was that I removed that hard code call for the logo for that static image. And I'm going to say fixed bike image. I'm going to go ahead and commit or stage it first, of course, and then commit it. And then I'm going to push. And when I publish the branch and push it, it's going to ask me from within, again, still Visual Studio Code, it's going to ask me if I want to create a pull request. And I do, because again, I want this out into production as much as possible. Now we're going to drag this over here. And we're going to pretend that I'm going to do my due diligence, and I've added in a fancy description of all the changes that this pull request includes. And when I go and create this, again, still within Visual Studio Code, it's going to pop up with a pull request insight that's giving me now information into what's happening in my GitHub. In fact, I can see that there's one pending check. I have a GitHub Actions workflow that is set up on this particular branch, on this particular repo, pardon me, and it's going to go through a series of tasks that make sense for this project. It's going to build the Docker image, it's going to publish that Docker image, and then it's actually going to deploy it to Kubernetes. But again, just as we were able to debug everything locally here in an isolated fashion, it's going to be able to tag that same header for Kubernetes to be able to do the routing. And I'm going to be able to view this pull request in an isolated fashion as well. So you'll see right now it logged into Docker. It's doing Docker build. It's going to set the AKS context to make sure I have access to the Kubernetes cluster from within this particular GitHub Actions workflow. And the final step right down here is adding a dash of confidence. That's what I like to call it. But it's actually going to add a comment to this pull request with that prefix, with that URL, where everyone can go and view it. Everyone who's involved with this particular code base, with this particular change. That way, not only do I have confidence in the pull request and the changes that I made, but everyone on the team does. Even those who previously and traditionally maybe weren't able to participate in a code review, now they can, because they can visualize all the changes that exist. So you can see the GitHub Actions bot added a comment of everything that this is included. You can see I still have a prefix, very similar to how I did with my Jessica prefix that I was working in when we were using our debugger. I'm going to go ahead and click this. It'll load. We'll click around and we should be able to see that our images are now working. But again, this did not take over actual production. This is in an isolated instance. In fact, if I remove the prefix, I'm just going to cut it away and hit enter, and I go to that same page, it's still broken in production. And the only change, the only pod that I pushed was that bikes change. I only made a change to one service in the context of our larger application. But because that routing manager and bridge to Kubernetes is in the picture, it's actually handling the communication between that one changed pod and that one changed service to all the other backend services. So we can still get that smooth developer inner loop and that smooth review process as we've seen with GitHub Actions.
That's very impressive. I would say, like, in less than 10 minutes, we just saw how you can debug the problem using your local debugger while your application still runs in Kubernetes.
Yep.
It doesn't touch the production. It created isolated pod where you can do the thing.
Yep.
Also, you saw how, I assume there's a GitHub repo available for everyone to look and learn how they can do the same GitHub action that allowed them to deploy this isolated branch for their application. And it's all in 10 minutes, and it was pretty impressive.
Thank you. Yeah, you can check out, I mean, this is a demo that I use, or a repo that I use for this particular demo. So you can head on over to my GitHub, JLDeen/bike sharing app. And the workflow that I used is right in the GitHub workflows file. And there's also even a workflow for where there's a PR closed. So when I close this, there's even a cleanup task. So it'll delete the deployment. For example, if we take a look at the deployment right here, and I do kget pods again, you're going to see a lot more pods, because you can see that now we have Envoy clones that have happened. And if I do kget deploy, I should also see a deploy for the bike image fix. And so we'll clean up that deployment as part of, again, keeping our environments and our development clusters and everything clean. As soon as I merge that pull request or that pull request closes, there's another GitHub Actions workflow that will go through that will clean everything up for us.
That's pretty cool. And if you want to see this demo or try it yourself, you can find this link in the description below. You can also find all these links to explaining how you can install Bridge to Kubernetes Visual Studio Code extension. And if you want to contribute, there is also a link for GitHub repo where we can get all the things around the source and contribution. I think it was pretty impressive. Jessica, what would be the best way if our listeners want to, contact you or your team and talk a little bit more about their needs for the tools?
The best way is going to be Twitter, and I'm bringing that up right now. So if you go to my Twitter page, which is twitter.com/JLDeen, let me bump this up right here, /JLDeen, that is 2 E's in my last name, Deen. I'm highly active on there, so you can tag me, message me if you have any questions. If I don't have the answer, I can put you in touch with someone who does, or at least tag the team, and we can have. I'm a very big fan of, if you have questions, to ask me publicly, because if you have a question, chances are someone else has a question or that same question, and then we can have an open dialogue very publicly on Twitter, rather than only helping you in the back end on DMs. As much as I love that too, it's sometimes I would love to help as many people as possible.
For this, I'm super grateful that Jessica found the time to talk to us today. I hope you folks who watching this had a great time to learning something new today and enjoying the knowledge that Jessica shared with us. Usual question that I ask my guests is that is there any book that you recently read, not necessarily technical, or it can be, I don't know, some good article, some long read, or maybe even some long read Twitter thread that you can recommend to our listeners?
That's a great question. I'm trying to think of the last book that sticks on my head that I read that was super memorable was a book called Shoe Dog by Phil Knight. I read that actually on a plane back from Sweden, so this was a little while ago. But that book was amazing. I couldn't put it down. As far as recently, I haven't read a lot of books because, as you mentioned earlier, I have been doing a lot of home projects. So I have watched a lot of YouTube videos about home projects.
All right. So, Jessica, thank you so much for being part of Kongcast.
Thanks to everyone out there for watching. I hope you enjoyed today's episode as much as we enjoyed recording it. Make sure to hit that like button now.
And be sure to subscribe so you don't miss a new episode.
Don't forget to drop us a comment if you have any questions for today's guest, or if there's a topic you'd like to see us cover in the future.
And we will see you on the next episode of Kongcast.